Oh, it says click anytime to view the post on the restream. Okay.
Okay, cool.
So, I'm Dr. Robin. I know many of you know me. It's my partner Aaron,
Hi.
um, and I want us to talk about um, part of understanding supremacy culture. And the thing that I want us to talk about today is the first pillar of white supremacy, which is perfection. And I've invited Aaron here today because Aaron um, has a way of understanding these things through the felt sense of the body. That's somatic language that I've picked up from you. And I come from this from more of a theoretical place. Not that I don't think it belongs or is lives in the body, but we come at this at different ways with language and with your background being embodiment. So we're going to talk about one of the pillars of white supremacy being perfection, and this comes from the Dismantling Racism workbook by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okum. And Serge put this out several years ago, and it's been resurfacing with our current uprising and whatnot. And so we all swim in this water of white supremacy, of supremacy culture. How does perfection show up in our bodies?
Yeah, well, I think it's worth to just contextualizing that, this is surfacing right now. This document is surfacing in part because it's helping us to see how insidious, um, and by that I mean just how how much it's permeated our culture, and similar to whiteness in general, it's this thing that's kind of elusive, and we struggle to see it, especially those of us who are hanging out in the dominant culture. And
Mm-hmm.
so the more we can bring language to this and then bring our awareness to it, which is somewhat of a somatic piece that I'll talk about in a second, the more seen and visible it becomes, and the more we can actually change it, right? Because we can't change what we're not aware of.
When I think about perfection, I think about a lot of the ways that white folks have in their mind, and to some extent people of color who have internalized racism like myself. We don't want to get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to mess up. We
Mm-hmm.
don't want to stray from the stream.
Yeah.
And that insidiousness of perfection just shows up.
So it's really funny that you're saying that because, like, right now, I'm experiencing perfectionism in my body.
Okay.
And it feels like, and I'll elaborate on that because when you said we don't want to get it wrong, I was like, oh my God, we're live streaming and I could get it wrong right now.
In
And that,
fact, I'm going to even check if we are live streaming
okay.
because we may be getting it wrong.
Because we might just be talking into
We
microphones
might just be talking to microphones.
in our office looking.
Oh no, we're living. 18 people are watching.
Oh my God, amazing. Well, hi, everybody.
So
So,
we're getting it right.
okay. No.
See what I did there?
No, we're not getting it right. What's happening is technology is choosing to work for this purpose
Yeah.
today.
Because let me tell you, y'all, I tried to do a podcast today with Jonathan Martin for his Zeitgeist. He was very excited to have me on. Couldn't get the technology to work. Supposed to record today with Ariel Astoria for the Sacred Feminine. Couldn't get the technology to work. So the fact that we are getting technology to work right now to talk about one of the pillars of white supremacy being perfection,
I think the universe wants this to happen
it's a
today.
testament. It's a
Yeah.
testament.
It's the universe is like, yeah, I think that this is the conversation that we need to have today. So I think that what I experience in my body right now is I'm starting to feel, in somatics, like we
And
talk
define
about.
somatics for
So
us.
we talk about somatics as a practice, and that word is coming up more and more in popularity right now, right? Because people are starting to see that when we want to dismantle white supremacy or whiteness in general, it can't just be a thought project. It can't just be a book club, but that it has to be this physical, this understanding of physical sensations and emotions and how those things are intertwined, and then how we can repattern those things over lots of time and with lots of practice and with lots of accountability to make changes at a body level.
Yep.
And so somatics is really centering our felt, lived inner experience as a way of knowing. And in this context, it is also talking about how that's connected to the whole, like how that's connected to our cultural whole. So people like Resmaa Menakem and
Brilliant.
and Tada Hazumi of the Selfish Activist, folks like that are doing this amazing work where they are really setting out entire curricula for all of us to try to unlearn and relearn new patterns in our bodies and then in our cultures, so that we can make new culture. Especially for white folks, because we don't necessarily, I was just talking about this today, we don't necessarily have a culture. And that's why I think for so many of us, it feels so scary to let go of power and to let go of being dominant, because without that, we often don't know who we are. And so our job is to create culture in this moment.
Except, were you saying that white folks don't have culture?
Yeah.
I think white folks do have culture.
Well, it's supremacy culture.
Right, exactly.
And so if we don't have supremacy, then we don't have anything.
Yeah.
Right. And many of us who are white are confused about our roots. We're confused about where we come from.
Yep.
And that is quite on purpose, right? So we don't understand. Oh, somebody says this is brainwashing by definition. Yeah, it is. So perfectionism. Whoa. I want to get back to that, because what I'm feeling in my body is heat.
Okay.
Okay. So there's like, and specifically in my chest, I might even be getting red, because that's what happens when I start to feel like I'm on the spot and like everybody's looking at me and I better know what the heck I'm saying. And so a somatic way of knowing is to be able to tap into our sensations. So my sensation is temperature is changing. That's a type of sensation. And then I also feel, well, I was feeling, it's loosened up a little bit now, but I was feeling this like constriction that was happening kind of around where my diaphragm is. And like, that was actually making it hard to breathe.
Yeah.
So
I just took a breath. So it's interesting that you articulate this, because these are anxieties that our body experiences when we perhaps stray from what is expected, right?
yeah, they are what I would describe it as, and what I think all the people I just mentioned and other people would say is that it's a trauma response. It's a trauma response. And so I think that we need to understand what those trauma responses are. And so this one feels like, let's see, perfectionism, and this, what it feels like in my body, kind of feels like it's freezing. So you may have heard of like fight, flight, freeze, appease, and there's another one, dissociate. But it's, for me, I'm feeling like a slight freezing, which is, unfortunately, I think sort of a cultural whiteness.
Yep.
That's how it shows up in our cultures. We just kind of freeze, and we kind of don't know what to do. And so I think it's important to talk about that right off the bat. Like, I'm experiencing this in my body, and then to know that how this kind of permeates our culture in other ways. Like, for me, perfectionism was like a big part of, unfortunately, how I grew up. And this was not intentional in any way, but this was just what I sort of inherited from my parents, who inherited it from their parents. And so the more we talk about it and name it, the easier it becomes to be able to like piece it apart and let go of it. So, yeah, do we want to talk about this, what it says here? Because I think it's really great information.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I have been doing over really the past decade is digging deeper into supremacy culture, which I just sort of put that label on reality a couple years ago. And particularly my work as a theologian and ethicist and a public scholar has been to connect the dots for people. And so we want to move through these pillars of white supremacy on live stream here to just extemporaneously talk about how these things show up, how these pillars of white supremacy show up in our day-to-day life and also impact people of color, right? So yeah, let's talk about how the Dismantling Racism workbook defines perfectionism.
Yeah, so the first bullet they say, and again, if you're just joining us, this is coming from Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. And this was for change work in 2001, so 19 years old. And it is it has been resurfacing through Surge, standing up for racial justice.
Showing up for racial justice.
Sorry, showing
That's
up.
okay.
Hey.
That's okay. Yeah.
And that's the thing, right?
Maybe
So,
that was my perfectionism.
No. But, I said, oh, sorry. And perfectionism is like one side of things, and the other side is that mistakes happen.
Yeah.
And that they're okay.
So we're gonna offer some antidotes to perfectionism, and that's one of them, that mistakes are okay.
Right. So here they talk about, I'm just gonna read all of these bullets, and then maybe we can just talk about our own experience with them. So the first one is little appreciation is expressed among people for the work that others are doing. Appreciation that is expressed usually is directed to those who get most of the credit anyway. Another bullet is more common is to point out either how the person or work is inadequate, or even more common to talk to others about the inadequacies of a person or their work without ever talking directly to them. Mistakes are seen as personal, i.e. they reflect badly on the person making them as opposed to being seen for what they are, mistakes. Making a mistake is confused with being a mistake, doing wrong with being wrong. There's little time, energy, or money put into reflection or identifying lessons learned that can improve practice. In other words, little or no learning from mistakes. And then tendency to identify what is wrong, little ability to identify, name, and appreciate what is right.
We have some comments here.
Oh, cool. Well, let's talk about this a little bit, and then we'll look at the comments and see what we can address. So, I think this is a really big one for me, and I think it's the one that out of all of these is really just so looming in my life. I would say
it's the one that surprises people the most, I think.
Yeah, like how it shows up.
Yeah.
You mean? Yeah. And so for me, like, I can just speak to my own experience, as both as a white person, but also as somebody who grew up dancing and who's trying to come at this from an embodiment perspective. And so something for me that is huge is like I've started to do some work with my mentor and teacher, Elizabeth Wolfe, who is amazing, who does embodied anti-racism training, and one of the things we do is we like actually feel into what perfectionism feels like in our bodies. And with, of course, a lot of support and sort of resources, in case we like go into like a crazy trauma response. Not crazy, in case we go into like, you know, a place that's really difficult to be. And I noticed that in doing this reflection, I was just so aware of how ballet training reinforced this idea of what I was perceiving to be a perfect body. And what I ended up doing is holding my breath.
Yeah.
Right. And so if breath is the ground of all being, and if it is the flow that the life flow, the life force that comes through us as humans, then if we want to be more alive, we've got to breathe more deeply.
Yeah.
And if my body is constricting because I want to have an upright spine and I want to appear like I am regal and I want to be skinny, and I want to have, you know, the perfect hairstyle and all of this, it's like almost like I can't move.
Yeah.
And I can't just let myself be how I actually am, because it doesn't measure up to a particular standard.
Well, and we could talk ad nauseum about ballet and the perils of dance. I mean, you have a whole life in that world. But I think it's a good example because perfectionism doesn't just show up in what we say, but it shows up in how we are in culture.
For sure. I mean, and it I think also shows up in what is reinforced in, at least in the dance community, or at the one that I was a part of growing up.
Well, and I mean, just coming from my schooling, there was a right way to think about theology, and when I veered off into queer of color critique, when I veered off into Latin American thought, that I was no longer orthodox, or I was no longer keeping the line. And that is how white supremacy showed up in my discipline.
Right. I mean, and we talk a lot, you and I, about that way of learning, even like that way of experiencing education is teaching you not morally and ethically what is right and wrong, but it's teaching you what is right and wrong in order to be accepted and to have power
within the dominant stream.
Within that dominant stream. And part of what you were not taught is to value the lived experience, and is to value somatic sort of beingness. Right?
Which I will say that when I was in college and I was exploring feminist theology, I was like the only person in the School of Theology where I would carry around my feminist theology books. That feminism, white feminism, and women of color feminism certainly, but my entry point was into white feminism. They valued experience, the lived experience of the sacred.
Right.
And so when I began to sort of come to understand my racialized self as a mixed race Latinx and began to read women of color who were talking about their lived experience, not one time did they bring up this notion of perfectionism.
Right.
That it was just about this lived experience. Now, I was reading it through the lens of theology and ethics, so there was a capacity for lived experience with the divine, but not one time did women of color talk about it through the language of perfectionism. For white feminists, they were trying to correct the patriarchal discourse, which is like a righting a wrong.
Right.
Which
it's like flipping a script.
Right.
Flipping a binary almost.
Right. Which I think what women of color feminists did is avoid that binary entirely and talk about the life force that is in their experience. And so it's very interesting sort of the racial implication in these two discourses.
And not only that, the gendered implication. I think
Yeah.
there's something really interesting that you're sort of highlighting, that first of all, white feminists came in and said to the white patriarchy, well, we're going to right your wrongs.
Mm-hmm.
And then black feminists or feminists of color came in and said, hey, what if we made a space for all of us? And that probably is going to mean that we have to look at our lived experience. Even if white women were saying to look at the lived experience, you can see how the lived experience was feminized.
Yep.
And therefore is maybe seen as less than,
Yep.
less reliable, let's say.
Right.
Which another one of these characteristics down the line is rationality.
Mm-hmm. Which is typically attributed to men or males.
Mm-hmm. And that if you're too emotional,
Yeah.
then we can't credit you. You're not credible, right? If you're too emotional, you're not credible. So I think there's some real interesting, like, of course, these things all intersect and overlap, overlap in ways that, you know, make it even more insidious.
Well, in these pillars, and we're gonna go through all of them in time, but these pillars create culture,
right?
And not only does it create culture, but it shapes behavior, right? And not only are we talking about an individual body, but we are talking about a collective body, a sociocultural body. That white supremacy is also part of the fabric, the water in which we're swimming, right? And you know, I think that the Enlightenment Project created conditions for white supremacy to emerge in many respects. But anything else you want to say about perfectionism?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we could probably talk for a long time about this. I guess before we talk about antidotes and what they offer here, I would love to see if there's comments or anything that we want to respond to or feel like that is necessary to respond to.
We've got a fair amount
of
comments. Hi, Rachel from the Bay. Rachel was in my ethics class in the Bay when I taught there.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so I don't really see any questions. Do you see questions?
No questions.
Yeah, so I do see something in the comments. Somebody is commenting about that perfectionism exists in other cultures and that it's not a white trait. I think that I'd like to just comment on that. Yeah, it's not a trait, but it is a characteristic. So I do think there's something slightly different. It's not inherent in me as a white person. I wasn't born with perfectionism, although some people could argue that the way that trauma is passed down through bloodlines, which there's endless proof, and regardless, there's experiential proof in the lives of Black folks who have inherited they've inherited generational trauma literally through the DNA. So in that way, I guess I would argue that maybe it is a trait. But I think what's important,
because let's just back up, because DNA as it's passed down is impacted by trauma.
Exactly.
And by our lived experience. And so the trauma that I've experienced, if I were to have offspring, would be passed through to my offspring in some capacity.
In some capacity, yeah. In that we are evolutionary creatures, right? And we adapt. And so our DNA, our cells are smart and they adapt, right? So I think it's important to note that. And I do think perfectionism absolutely exists in other cultures. I think our purpose in looking at this is that in this particular country, in this particular moment, and the 500 years that preceded this, white supremacy has been an issue that, not an issue, it has been a way of life
Mm-hmm.
that has created such gross monstrosities in terms of what has happened to people of color, especially Black folks. And so I think that we owe it to the beginning of the reparations process and the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of what I think we're trying to do culturally, where we're trying to shift things and create new narratives. We owe it to the people of color and to Black folks to be having these types of conversations as much as possible, and to be highlighting how whiteness, yeah, white isn't a race, right? We know that it's this compounded, made up thing that's grouped a bunch of ethnicities together, but whiteness is a thing with
Right.
which we have to contend
Right.
and with which we have to work so that we can begin to break it down and understand, or not even understand, how we can create equity. How do we create equity, right?
Yeah, and
So that's the purpose of this.
I'm sure that y'all have seen the image that has been going around the people looking over the fence at the baseball game or the softball game.
Mm-hmm.
And the tallest person doesn't need a box. The next tallest person needs one box. The shortest person needs 3 boxes. And what is interesting about that is it seems that one size fits all. That the shortest person will always need so many amounts of boxes. And what that article came out is that this is a product of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to talk about equity without talking about liberation.
Well, and what's still happening is these 3 people are of different statures, are standing outside an arena,
Right.
and they're still, once they've gotten the boxes and they
Still
can all
outside.
see, they're still outside the
Yep.
arena. So it's like, yeah. I also wanted to say, I saw a comment from somebody that said something around how the supremacy culture, specifically this idea of perfection, has really affected children.
Yep.
And brilliant point, and that they are expected to behave in schools and social settings, and that perfection is the standard to strive toward. And I'd be interested too to hear more about what you are thinking. Like, what does that actually mean, right? And like, because I think that for if we're looking at this inside of white supremacy culture, perfectionism means you sit still,
Right.
you do not speak unless you're called on, and that essentially asks us to deny anything that's happening in our body,
Mm-hmm.
any type of discomfort, any urge to socialize with our kin,
Right.
It reinforces these other ideas of white supremacy, like around individualism, that you're just there on your own accord. Like, there's just so much about that in the classroom.
Well, another comment here from the same person who was talking about
Mm-hmm.
children and behaving, that trauma is being coded into our DNA. Absolutely. And the question is, how do we collectively begin to heal the traumas in our very bodies and communities, which is what the Activist Theology Project is trying to do, talk about social healing, individual and collective healing. And I believe, and Aaron and I have done a workshop on somatics and social healing, that it does start with our bodies. It's not just about having talking points. It's not just being able to argue about why supremacy culture should be dismantled. It's about a beingness, if you will, to use Heidegger's term, which he's problematic in other ways, but to talk about this beingness that dismantles the very ways in which this culture has promulgated our bodies and caused us to be DNA coded in such a way that we are perpetuating harm.
So I think how we to answer the question, how do we collectively begin to heal the traumas? Obviously, we have to do our own individual work, but I think that so many white folks, especially including me, have had access to a disproportionate amount of ways that we can heal from trauma, like therapy and you know other resources like going to therapy. And we see that that's not actually connecting the dots to a cultural sort of body, to a bigger sort of issue. And so I think that part of that is not only beginning to look at our own healing, but in the context of how is that then perpetuating? How is that either perpetuating where I am in terms of my stature or my access or my power, and how can I learn ways to unhinge from that? So I think the other thing I think when I think of the word healing is, and as someone who facilitates healing, it's a process, and it's a literal, like, I'm learning a new language. I need time. I need space. I need to not be rushed. And I need accountability. I need support, right? So there's so many things that I need to be able to heal, and we need that as a culture. And I think to go back to this idea of perfectionism, there's something that happens. There's something that happens when we're constantly demanding perfection. Then it almost, I don't know if it almost, I think it suppresses in some way our natural ability to heal. Like, our bodies are built to heal.
Like, are you saying that maybe enzymes or cellular functions that would promote healing are suppressed?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, and I haven't done all of that research, but I do think that there are reasons that we can only be, like, our bodies are naturally ready to go to town for us, and I think what's happening is that we kind of get in the way.
Yeah.
So I think by basically going to cultural therapy is how we might heal the whole, right? Like, and there are people who are working on this right now, like the people I mentioned,
Yeah.
Resma Menachem and Tata Huzumi. They are borrowing from all sorts of different sort of lineages and ways of looking at psychological health,
Yeah.
and then they are essentially offering inroads to various groups of people. Like, Resma works with white people, with people of color. He calls them people or bodies of culture, and police officers, right? So he's got these sort of three different groupings of folks that he works with. I'm not sure how Tata does his work because I'm still learning about him, but I think that these folks are really every day of their lives trying to help all of us make connections between this sort of body, individual level healing, how that affects you, our community, and then how that goes beyond, right, and out into the whole culture.
Yeah, and I think I wanna
I
also
gotta get
say
water.
that so many of us are reading all the books right now, right? How do we become anti-racist? And yes, we should be doing that, and also realizing that we have been discursively shaped by powers and structures that impact our bodies. And so every day I must um, unhinge from white supremacy in my own life, in my home life, with my partner here. Um, and every day I work to dismantle supremacy culture. And I do that individually, I do that collectively with my partner, and then we work to do it in society. And so what I'm hoping that these little fireside chats that we're going to be doing is giving some tools to people to know how to talk about are cultural norms into which we are conscripted that are harming us.
Mm-hmm. And not just to talk about, not to just to know how to talk about them, but literally by repeating this is a somatic theory and idea. By repeating this information and naming it over and over and over, it actually creates a practice. Mm-hmm. So rather than just knowing how to talk about something, which is important, we also create a practice of naming. And in repeating that, right, we are literally creating new pathways, new neural pathways. And the more, again, like I was saying at the beginning, the more we're aware, the more we're able to change something. If we're not even aware of it, or we're in denial of it, then we don't have hope at changing anything, right? So we're doing this also in an effort to create some consistency around our use of this language, and also then to be able to recognize it in our lived experience, right?
Well, and also to be transparent that we all suffer from the harm of white supremacy. And if we are not transparent about the ways that we are shifting our beingness, then we're not being as honest as we could be. And so coming on, doing some live streams, talking about the pillars of white supremacy, not only gives us a chance to be in conversation with one another, but also with ourselves. I just see someone comment about the inner work. This is an outpouring of our inner work that we have been doing for years, really. And, since we can't go anywhere anyways because of the strange times of COVID, why not utilize technology and try to be in conversation with people and help other people have conversations and learn how to locate these scripts that are in our bodies, right? These scripts are wedged in our bodies very deep.
Yeah. And we don't know them unless we start to get friendly with our sensations that come up, especially when we're uncomfortable. I do want to also say, somebody said, you can't expect to fix a problem in your body with just your mind. You have to also go from body to mind, not vice versa. I love that. And just like an appreciation that we were talking about this. There was something else that they said though. Okay, well, I don't know what it was, but I think that's beautiful. And I think also I invite us to think of the body and the mind as one thing. The body, the mind, the spirit, the heart, the emotion. Like
it's one entity.
We are one entity with these sort of differentiated flavors that come forward and back in varying moments, right? And so I also think that along the lines of this this inner work, this person said, which of course can only go as fast as individuals are willing to do the individual inner work. It's a brilliant point, because I think that it's a hard thing to try to ask somebody to do, right? And we're being asked to do that,
and in fact, hurry up is another pillar of white supremacy. We're going to get to that. That's the next one, the sense of urgency.
I think it is the next one. Yeah, but I think that's a brilliant point, that we can't literally, no one can do inner work but you or me on myself. And so I think we're culturally being asked to do inner work as a culture, but we can't also leave out our own stuff, right? We can't just do that. We just can't assume that that's going to happen on a cultural level if we're not doing it at an individual level. The point, though, I think that's important to reiterate is that, yes, we have to do the inner work individually and continue to connect that to relationships, right? To relationships outside of ourselves and to other, to our communities and to our whole culture. Yeah. So do you want to talk about this?
Well, we could talk about antidotes if you are game. Now this dismantling racism workbook was intended for organizations or teams, and so some of the language here is talking about organizational structure, but I think it applies because we live in community. Many of us have roommates or partners or housemates,
Mhm.
and I think it applies.
Yeah, and also just an invitation to look at our relationships as fractal, right? So, and I mean that by or micro and macro, right? So
Hmm.
things that are happening on a cellular level are happening at the body level, and they're happening in a partnership, and they're happening in a group, and they're happening in a culture, and maybe even on the whole planet.
Yeah.
And so there's a fractal kind of quality to this relationship. So I think there's deep value in looking at this, and culture really is like
A
a
bunch of
large
practices made
collection
up.
of
Yeah.
a large collection of people
Yeah.
that is like this widely accepted practice. So so
So
yeah.
so one of them is an antidote to perfection or perfectionism is a culture of appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how many of us go through the day being criticized and expected to get in line and do our work and never hear a comment about appreciation.
Yeah, I wonder if we could practice that right now.
I appreciate your spontaneity to do this.
Thank you, because I get so nervous. My chest gets all red. I'm Thanks. I appreciate. Oh man, I appreciate your dedication to this work that has just been. It's been so steadfast, and I appreciate your willingness to trust me and to be
Yeah.
your sidekick in
Yeah.
this. Um, and I also really appreciate that you make dinner every night.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you're a really good chef.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate breakfast every morning.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate also though your character and how do you just continue to show up in the world no matter how many stupid comments you get on social
Hmm.
media or hate mail you might get. It doesn't stop you ever from speaking the truth
Hmm.
and from or speaking what you know to be true in what I perceive as a dedication toward our collective liberation.
Hmm.
So I really appreciate that about you.
Yeah, it's amazing if we could create a culture of appreciation because it would shift our interpersonal
Yeah.
dynamics.
So I wonder too if for those of you, there might be like 5 of you who are watching, just, maybe that's something for you to take home and like consider and feel into like, where could I offer somebody some appreciation, especially maybe someone that you've been hard on, or somebody who you can only seem to sort of see their mistakes. I think that's something I would want to highlight too, that as a white person who is committed to anti-racism, I understand it's a journey,
Hmm.
and I understand that I may never arrive. I understand that there's some people out there who don't think I should be doing this work, and I totally get that. And I also want to just offer to, especially if there's other white people watching, just that this is a process,
Hmm.
and when our perfectionism comes up, it can look like, oh well, I've read White Fragility and this person hasn't, and so they don't know what they're talking about, right? This other white
Hmm.
person doesn't know what they're talking about, or they're using language that is really outdated and I can't be associated with them,
Hmm.
right? There's a sort of elitism that can start to crop up again, because we don't want to be associated with the white people who don't know what they're talking about, who or generally who are doing harm, right? So I wonder, part of this group that I'm in right now, some of our homework is to get closer to other white people who are new to the work, because quite frankly, me as a white person, like, I haven't always been where I am now. I've had to learn a lot of things,
Hmm.
right? And so I think that when we live into that and feel into that, we're really asking for to be met where we are, and I think that's a much more viable way of living instead of going, well, you did this wrong, you said this wrong, right? And I'm totally guilty of that too, like of being like, well, you said this thing wrong, and I don't know if I can like really get down because they said this. I definitely have done that. So I think that the more we can offer appreciation, especially in the areas where it's hard for us to do that, maybe we have a shot at sort of like chiseling away at this sort of wall of
Yeah, and
perfectionism.
I think another antidote is creating conditions for curiosity. The language here is develop a learning organization, and part of learning is being curious about something. And so, how can we create a culture of curiosity so that we can dismantle the perfectionism?
Yeah, and curiosity, when I hear that word, sometimes I think about the opposite of that for me. And that is like when I'm activated and when I'm in a fear place, I can't be curious. It shuts off, right? And actually, there is neuroscience. I can't repeat it all because I don't know
Yeah.
that information, but there is legit neuroscience that says, hey, when you're activated, i.e. your trauma response is like flashing, there's a red flag warning, watch out. It shuts off all of this great brilliant innovation up here, and it shuts off our ability to be curious because we're trying to protect ourselves. So I think there's something that the more we can develop that appreciation, that would lead to curiosity.
Yeah. And opportunities for learning.
And then of course learning can take place.
I think the thing that feels so important to say is when we create relationships that demand to be in line or demand to be perfect, where mistakes cannot be made, that is not a relationship of curiosity. That is not a relationship that is oriented to learning. And so how many of us have jobs or in family relationships or interpersonal relationships that demand this kind of perfection? Maybe they don't use the term perfection, but there is some sort of hint at, well, if you don't do it this way, and how that doesn't foster learning or curiosity. I want to be about work that fosters learning and curiosity in every aspect of my life.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. So let's see. So somebody says internally and externally doing. So I think they were talking about the invitation to express appreciation, and doing that actively with a neighbor. It's a lived practice. It
Yes,
changes
absolutely.
how you are in your body. We would love to hear
Absolutely.
more about how
Yeah.
that changes how you are in your body. Appreciate you. Oh, thank you. Yes. It is so hard. Sometimes it's hard work to find ways to appreciate the people that, really tick us off. But I've always heard it's like, well, whatever you don't like in somebody else is usually the thing
Right.
you don't like in yourself.
Right.
I'm like, damn it, why does
Yeah.
that have to be so true? When I really think about it, I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
Love the positive invitations. Yes, yeah, yes. So many invitations. I'm glad that this is resonating in some way with folks. Thank you so much for watching this random thing too.
Well, and our invitation is that you'll look for our next live stream where we're going to talk about sense of urgency.
Wait, are we? Let's see.
Is that the next one?
Oh yeah, it is. Look
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, sense of urgency. That one's one that I've been sitting with for quite some time. Let's see if there's just one or two other things on here to just going back to this this is more antidotes, right, for perfectionism. Going back to this, creating an environment where people can recognize that mistakes sometimes lead to positive results. I just want to speak on that for a moment. I have a background in dance and specifically in improvisation. And so it's almost all about how do we be curious each moment, and how does that moment build to the next moment, knowing that we're all sort of in this like collective curiosity together. And I think that I almost would never even call it a mistake, right? Or at least not a failure. It's
Mm-hmm.
never a failure. It's always just, I'm learning something,
Yeah.
right? I'm learning this new way. And so sometimes maybe you try something in an improvisational setting and it doesn't go the way you thought it would, but at least you tried,
Yeah.
right? And then your nervous system really does learn from that
Mm-hmm.
trying. And so just creating a place, a space, an environment where we can make mistakes and we can move forward after we've made the mistake. I think it's important to have an accountability practice, and that's a whole other live
Yeah.
stream that we'll probably have to
Yeah.
have. So I'm not saying that people can just walk away when they've created real harm, but that perfectionism can keep us from admitting, or from being comfortable making mistakes.
Well, and I just want to add one other thing characteristic of perfectionism can be workaholism,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
shows up in white supremacy culture all the damn time.
Yeah.
And, constantly working, no play, constantly trying to get the work out. That's part of perfectionism and a sense of urgency. And
Mm-hmm.
there's, we're gonna try to uncover so much of this in our live streams. But our invitation to you is to come talk with us on our porch as we explore these pillars of white supremacy culture. Um, I don't know how often we'll do this. Maybe once a week
Yeah,
because
we'll
we've
see.
we've got other things going on. Um,
I do want to get to this because this person said polyvagal theory, ways to relational moving out of fight, flight, or freeze. And that is so beautiful. Thank you for saying that. So, polyvagal theory, in case folks are wondering what the heck that is, the vagus nerve is this long nerve that Resma, I actually think, does the best job talking about in his book. So I would definitely buy that book if you're interested in knowing what the heck this thing is. But essentially, it's a nerve. There's a cranial nerve, so it goes all the way from here, so where the base of our skull is, and it connects to the left side of our face, and it connects to the heart and to the lungs, and it connects to the guts, right? So it's connected to this whole thing. And polyvagal theory basically just suggests that, like, we can learn how to activate our vagus nerve toward the place of quote unquote rest and digest. You may have heard that term.
mhm.
It's a term for the parasympathetic nervous system, which is this whole structure within us that helps us recuperate right after we've had a traumatic experience, or if we have these trauma responses that are still hanging out in our system.
Right.
How we can return to like a home base or homeostasis, or maybe even better than neutral. And so there's a lot of practices that are being built around this polyvagal theory right now. And that's actually what I'm trying to do in some of my somatic work, and my teachers do that. And so if that's interesting to you, would love you to come to our class that we host on Sundays, because we kind of hang out and do weird somatic things.
I just want to comment
Yeah.
here about the workaholism tendency is directly tied to capitalism. Absolutely. And we know that capitalism and white supremacy are interlocking friends and they fuel each other. But yes, absolutely. Workaholism is about production, and so is capitalism. And so I think maybe we'll end there.
Okay.
Our invitation is to come be with us on the porch or in the library, if it were, as it were, and to talk about these pillars of white supremacy. Next up is a sense of urgency. We'll tackle that next time.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, y'all.
Thanks.